The world had 6 years of dreadful conflict for the second time in its history, resulting in many deaths, casualties, and injury. But why did World War break out again in 1939? Many historians agree that it was because of the failure of the League of Nations during the 1930s. On 11th of November 1918, delegates from 32 countries came to Paris to make the treaties which would end the war, also known as Paris Peace Conference. They established several treaties, including the Treaty of Versailles. Conference lasted for 3 days. During the conference, the President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, brought up his 14 points, and he came up with the idea of creating an international peacekeeping organization to prevent any happening of war in the future. Wilson's idea was favored, and so the League of Nations was set up in January 10th, 1920. Its headquarters was held in Geneva, in Switzerland. In 1920, 40 countries were the members of the League of Nations. Later in 1930, more than 60 countries were members. Now, let's look at the organization of the League of Nations. There are three main parts in the League: Assembly, Council, and agencies and commissions. Assembly. This is where all members of the League meet once a year to discuss the problem and help each other. Decisions were made only by unanimous vote. Council is where a small group of nations meet 4 or 5 times a year to solve international disputes. There were four permanent members of the Council, which were Britain, France, Japan, and Italy. Agencies and commissions took care of more smaller issues like minority rights and helping refugees. There are Health, Refugee, Slavery, Mandates Committee, and Permanent Court of International Justice, as well as international labor organizations. Okay, now you might be asking, wait a minute, where's the United States? The answer to this is very simple. The United States was not the member of League of Nations, which is kind of strange because it was President Wilson's idea to establish this organization. Reason for this is because when Wilson came back to the United States, he lost his power and he wasn't able to persuade the United States to join the League. The United States became more isolationist, which meant the United States did not want to interfere any conflict happening in Europe. There are two other major powers which wasn't in the League of Nations in the beginning, which was Germany and USSR. Germany was not allowed to join League of Nations until 1925, when they signed the Locarno Treaty. So for Germany, League of Nations was more like winners club rather than peacekeeping organization. USSR refused to join League because they were communists and they hated Britain and France. With that being said, let's look at the League in practice. League had three main ways to solve a conflict: condemnation, arbitration, and sanctions. Condemnation means group of nations telling nations in the conflict that they're doing it wrong. Arbitration is giving opportunities to let nations in conflict and decide between them. Sanction is basically stopping trades. So here's another weakness of the League. It does not have its own army. So, in fact, the League of Nations was powerless. But to fill this weakness, the League of Nations used something called collective security, which means if one member of the League is in danger, other member is going to help them. However, the League of Nations seemed very functional in 1920s when there were conflict between small nations, such as Island Crisis in 1921 between Sweden and Finland, or the crisis in Turkey in 1924, or the crisis between Bulgaria and Greece in 1925. But in 1930s, there were two main conflicts caused by two of the League's permanent members. In 1932, Japanese army invaded Manchuria, setting up their own government and throwing Chinese people away. So China appealed to the League for help. So 1 year later, in 1933, League of Nations told Japan to stop invading. Japan simply refused it, walked out from the assembly, and quit League of Nations, then continued invading Manchuria. Although the League tried to put sanctions on Japan, many countries had important trade links with Japan, so they didn't. Also, Japan's main trading partner was the United States, so sanctions from France and Britain were meaningless for Japan anyways. After this dispute, it was obvious that the League was powerless against determined aggressor like Japan. Also, it showed that Britain and France didn't want the war and only thing they could do was nothing but to watch Japan take over Manchuria. Later, in 1935, the League was tested again. Italy invaded Abyssinia, which is Ethiopia at that time. This time, the League sanctioned Italy by stopping the weapon sales. But it wasn't enough for Italy to stop. Although Britain and France could have stopped this invasion by closing the Suez Canal, Britain and France feared Italy to be on Hitler's side, so they couldn't. Also, Britain and France secretly agreed to give Abyssinia to Italy, which was called Hors-la-Vaux Pact. But it failed, Mussolini ignored this, and Mussolini invaded the whole Abyssinia. Many historians agree the League of Nations died after the Abyssinian crisis. Overall, the League of Nations was such a failure since the foundation. The organization and attitude of the members were a critical reason. The League of Nations did work on smaller and weaker countries, but became powerless once stronger countries determined to be aggressive.